Welcome to Capitals Uncovered, the Pelle, Neroth, Taylor, and Martin Sieff show. And we've got a good friend with us, Dirk Pohlmann from Germany, although now he's in Crete, and he's a very well-known documentary maker, perhaps the leading figure in the alternative media in Germany after a very distinguished career in mainstream journalism, but he just got so fed up with that. And that's kind of going to be our theme today. Dirk, you're looking extremely well, and it looks as if you're enjoying Crete very much. Welcome to our show, and hope to have you on much more in the future. But Dirk, I was just researching, well, two things that have kind of opened up because I haven't seen them even in the alternative media, and Martin and I can talk about it in future shows, or I don't know if we'll have time today. And that is the American dispensationalist movement. I mean, the religious people who read the Bible and have created this conspiracy theory about, the rapture and how they'll. I'm coming to it as a European, and we think that had disappeared like 10 years ago because we don't hear about it, but perhaps it's still there. It's a vast kind of underground movement from our perspective with tens of millions of people following it. But this story, and there are novels written about it, and there's TV channels and so on, and middle America still believes it. And that's where, when Trump is kind of talking about the Pope and presenting himself as Jesus, maybe he's kind of echoing that, maybe because they're the most loyal audience. I mean, he's still got a 70% approval rating, but basically this idea that the 1,000-year-old kingdom of Christ, the second coming, only comes after a sequence of events, which includes the gathering of the Jews in Israel, the arrival of Gog and Magog, and the destruction, these bad guys who kind of try and fight Israel, their destruction by God, then the arrival of the Antichrist, then the Armageddon, and so on. And Gog and Magog, if you look at certain parts of the Bible, there are names there that sound like Russia. Persia is mentioned explicitly. Turkey is mentioned. So if you want to know why the Israelis are targeting Turkey, maybe it's because they're channeling this. And of course, we've got the perfect storm with extremists in Israel, and they're talking about building the second temple, or third temple, sorry, which the second temple was destroyed in 70 AD, which will, of course, create a Middle Eastern war because it's Al-Aqsa, the Dome of the Mosque there, which is a very holy site for the Muslims. But of course, that's part of the myth, the conspiracy theory myth of events, 5 or 6 big events that the evangelicals think is going to be part of. Hegseth is an evangelical, and apparently even Vance, according to my AI research, but I thought he's one of the good guys. Anyway, I think we could talk about that later, but we're going to talk about another sort of link between Israel and the West, and that's the German one. The Germans, of course, had the Holocaust as this huge burden, and they've always been very supportive of Israel. And Dirk, you and I have talked about how the Israelis got their nuclear weapons support back in Germany back in the 1960s when the Eichmann trial was on. Eichmann, of course, made the Holocaust apparent to a lot of people who hadn't thought about it at all in the 1950s. And then, but now we've got Merz, we've got Merkel, we've got the entire German elite, the Atlanticist elite, marching as one on the Zionist topic. And the restrictions on protesting against Palestine, Israel, are quite strong in Germany. And Merz has specifically called it's a Staatsräson, a reason of state, that Israel's security is Germany's security. So it seems as if Germany, but of course at the same time, the UN and many other bodies, including B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights body, and many others, talked about the Israeli genocide. So the Germans seem to be supporting genocide, even as they are trying to get away from the label of being Holocaust supporters. The German public, 27% of the German public thinks as Israel should be supported strongly. It must be 0% among the under 30s. So here we have a case where the German establishment, all the ones who belong to the German Marshall Fund and write for the mainstream press, are totally at odds with what normal people think, especially young people. What do you make of this, Dirk?
Yeah, it is exactly as you say. You could say in an ironic term, we're always on the wrong side. Yeah, so it was very much so in the 30s, and although Germany had a country where the assimilation of Jews had been strongest in Europe, so the Prussian state was very good, and they were in high positions as well. Yeah, so that really worked, and it worked really well because it fit together in a way. Let's say the Jewish Jewish intellectual side and from the German side, that is something that goes together well. It was even the kind, I don't want to get in that, but during the First World War, let's say, international Jewry, there was a newspaper which said it's an holy war and the Jews have to be on the side of Germany in World War One. So that is something, if you hear it today, which is really weird. So it's and much weirder was that it was possible to get into the anti-Semitic frenzy in the 30s. And although it was not extremely popular in the population, anti-Semitism, it was, of course, there was the possibility for everyone who wanted to be anti-Semite and killer was there. And that happened. It were normal people, and it was quite modern to be that. So the National Socialist movement was a movement of modernity. It was the resistance came from rather conservative places like the Catholic Church, not so much the Protestant Church. But to get into that, what you said, what Merz just said about the Staatsräson, the original from that is from Angela Merkel, who held a speech in front of the Knesset in 2008 for the 60th anniversary of the founding of Israel. She was the first foreign head of state. I mean, head of state in the meaning that she was the head of a government, not somebody who was a celebrity status in the government, first ever. So the first running head of a state being able to speak in front of the Knesset was Angela Merkel in 2008. That met quite a lot of resistance also in Israel. Not everybody was happy. But that's a rehearsal of the story of Adenauer and Ben-Gurion, and I get into that if I may. Yeah? So she
Definitely.
said in that speech, she was talking about Iran, and it was the threat of a nuclear weapon from Iran. And there the quote was that the raison as a state reason, I don't know if you have an English word for that, Staatsräson, it's in
Reason of
German.
state, yeah.
It's the purpose of the state. The purpose of the state is the security of Israel. This is what she said. And that was a little bit weird because you could say, I would argue that from Second World War, we should have learned that Germany has to stand for the implementation and also the execution of international law. That should be our position, that we are strongly with everything, with the human rights and so on. So we are always on the side of the law. But this, she said, the state, and it was connected to Iran. She said, it's not that the world has to prove to Iran that they don't want a nuclear weapon. That was 2008. Yeah, so 20 years ago. But Iran has to prove that they don't want a nuclear weapon. And this is going on since 1984. But the reason I think she was invited to do that, speak in front of the Knesset, is that Germany paid for the Israeli nuclear program. And just 3 weeks ago, there was an article in Haaretz who stated that. I had it in my documentary, which I recommend because it's the first one worldwide about the history of the nuclear program. And then 14 years ago, I showed the document, which Haaretz now also quotes. And that was a document related to the Eichmann trial, but not exactly. It started earlier. It started in 1952. In 1952, Germany was just founded, 49, Federal Republic of Germany founded. And the first international treaty Germany had was with Adenauer. He went to Israel and he talked to Ben-Gurion, and they were providing weapons and ships and a lot of equipment to Israel on a large scale. 3.5 billion marks, which was an enormous amount at that time. It's not like today. But so that was the first treaty that Germany had, international treaty. And that was the idea of Adenauer was to what he called, I don't know if there is also an English word for that. It's you pay the money for the damage that you've done, but not only that, you pay it because you want to make it good again. It's the wordly translation for Wiedergutmachung. And the Israelis never accepted that term, which was popular in Germany. We refurbish the attitude between Germans and Israel and Jews, which is not possible, of course, after that. But she wanted to do that. Adenauer wanted to do that, and then a lot of trouble came. But basically, in '61, in the Eichmann process, the Israelis used this trial because Germany feared that the role of Hans Globke would become a major thing because he was connected to Eichmann and the Third Reich. And he was a member of the government of Adenauer. He was the head of the chancellery. The head of the chancellery is also the head of the intelligence service in Germany. So that was quite a thing. And so it was like the Israelis were using that in a way that maybe we talk about, maybe not. Germany wanted not. And then came this the offer of paying 200 million marks per year for 10 years to Israel for the erection of a nuclear desalination plant in the Negev. And nuclear and Negev is correct, desalination plant not, it never happened. That was Dimona. So the Israel nuclear program became possible with the help from Germany giving the money, and the technological side was from France. France, Dimona is basically a copy of Marcul, the plutonium production plant in France. In my documentary, I have Dino Brugioni. He was the head of the picture evaluation and the CIA, and he had U-2s flying over Europe, U-2s flying over Israel, and he showed to Eisenhower. He tells that in my interview, like a cardboard with two sides, and said, "This is Marcul, this is Dimona. You notice it's exactly the same." So the Israelis are building a nuclear bomb like the French have just done. The French first bomb exploded in 1960. And nobody was happy about that. Nobody from the old nuclear powers wants a new nuclear power. And Israel swore that they don't have the intention to build a nuclear bomb. And it's quite interesting. In my documentary, I had a ton of interviews for that, and the Israeli military was not in favor of a nuclear bomb for very pragmatic reasons.
Yes.
It was, they needed guns and ships and boots and all kind of tanks and airplanes, and not spend a ton of money for a pipe dream that might never come true. They wanted to spend the money for what they needed. And there were three people, which was Ben-Gurion. It was David Bergman, a scientist who had been in Berlin in the 30s, who had to leave Germany because he was Jewish, a chemist. And there was Perez, who was...
Yes.
These were the three people who were driving that. They had the idea that a nuclear bomb basically could be the life insurance for Israel. So if you have a nuclear bomb, then the whole attitude has to change. And the French president, a socialist at that time, and several intellectuals in French also in France said, we owe the Israelis the bomb because they are surrounded by enemies and we have to protect them. And Germany, that is, it's never been acknowledged, but I think it's to make an educated guess is first they wanted a better relationship with Israel because that was the main obstacle worldwide, the killing of the Jews in World War II. It was not a big issue during World War II for the Allies, but afterwards it became. And also they wanted an own nuclear bomb. That was Strauss. He was the Minister for Defense, and he definitely wanted a nuclear bomb for Germany. And they were dealing with France. France also wanted to have an own bomb because they wouldn't trust the Americans to protect Europe in case of a war. And then with the Sputnik, the whole thing changed massively because then when it was clear that there would be rockets, then there would be the possibility that the Americans trade with the Soviets, Europe for United States. So keep the war in Europe if you leave us with the rockets alone in USA. Before that, it would have been impossible for the Soviets to attack the United States, really. They didn't have the long-range bombers for that and so on. But with the rockets, the whole thing changed. So at that moment, Germany and France both, and Italy, had the idea that it would be better for them to have nuclear bombs themselves. So I think the payment of the German government for the Israeli nuclear program was trying to, like in snooker, to go via via the border and trying to get an own nuclear weapon
Mm-hmm.
via this, because the American side, especially Kennedy, was extremely against nuclear, obtaining a nuclear weapon, but also Germany. It was out of discussion that Germany would be allowed to be a nuclear power. So that is the basic setting. But it was all kept secret. And when I published my documentary 14 years ago, it was on German and French public TV. It became quite an issue, not in the public. Nobody followed up on the. I showed the document which said we pay this amount of money that had to be released by a Freedom of Information Act, sort of, in Germany, because of the Eichmann trial. The files of the Eichmann trial were ordered by a court to be public, and it was in these files. So this is how it got to the public. And then I was notified by a guy inside ZDF that there had been calls from the chancellery to the head of ZDF. So what are you doing there? Are you nuts? What are you? You're spilling the beans, yeah? And I was astonished. I thought it was a coup, a journalistic coup, but it was also an issue of politics, yeah? But this is the background of that. There are a lot of side stories which are extremely interesting. For example, there had been an attack on Adenauer in 1952. A bomb was sent to Adenauer, which killed the guy in the German police who tried to defuse it. And it came out very late, like 30, 40 years later. There was the guy who sent the bomb. He was on the Israeli media, and he said that he was the one building the bomb, and they wanted to get it to Adenauer. And it was on the order of Menachem Begin, he said.
Yes, yes,
So
yes.
Begin, that is also important because Ben Gurion wanted, of course, to deal with Germany to get the money and the weapons, which they needed from Germany. But the biggest demonstration that had happened up to that time in Israel were the demonstration against this, what they call blood money from Germany. And that was Menachem Begin was running on that issue. He was leading the demonstrations, and you also have to acknowledge at that time in the Israeli passports it said valid for all countries except Germany. So that Germany would give money to Israel was a huge issue in the Israeli public and Begin. And Ben Gurion wanted that, but he couldn't talk about it, of course. He gave very weak reasons. The Germans are not the same as before, and so on. But that was not really carrying the message why they should deal with that. But maybe I talk too much, and Martin
No, I'll
should
ask
talk.
you a question, and then Martin, sorry.
Okay.
The first thing is what happened to the German nuclear program. So the quid pro quo, they'd outsourced their nuclear production to the Israelis, and then they're smuggling nuclear weapons so they could face down the Russians. I know that Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, said if they do that, we're going to attack straight away, because the Russians, for obvious reasons, had an obsession with the German threat, and if they get nukes, we have to do a preemptive attack. So the Germans were risking World War III. But I mean, there were many
Yes.
hotheads in the
Yes.
German administration who did that. And then the second thing I just wanted to emphasize was that, because I did some research on this, that was it Globke? I mean, the Adenauer administration had some ex-Nazis among it,
Oh, yeah.
and that the Germans, the Israelis, with the enormous reputation, the enormous coverage of the Eichmann trial was a perfect example for the Israelis to highlight how the Germans hadn't changed at all. So there was a kind of blackmail there, wasn't there? The Israelis said, "Okay, we'll go quiet on," and the head of NATO was a Nazi, Ollenhauer, the head of the NATO military committee, was a former Wehrmacht officer. So they thought, well, if we're quiet about this, we'll get money for the Germans to develop our nuclear program. Yeah.
Yes, all correct what you say. It was not Ollenhauer, that is a guy from the Social Democrats, but the head of NATO for that time was a Nazi German general at that time already. Yeah, he was a general in Nazi. Yeah, so that was, and there were a lot of Nazis, and that was, by the way, one of the reasons why when this bomb came to Germany to kill Adenauer himself was toning the things down. So he made sure that the trial would not become public, that it was put into the gravel or swept under the rug. Yeah. So and the reason was if they had been a trial in 1952, they just had to start to deal with the Israelis, and then the people investigating in Germany would be most of these people in the German police. The police was deeply embedded into the killings in the East. The police force was blood all over their hands, and the people who were in the criminal police, three-quarters of them in the BND, for example, were former SS officers.
Of course.
So imagine that you have an SS officer investigating this Jewish-Israeli plot, and then if they would go to trial, probably the judge would be what we call what would you call the terrible judges? Terrible judges. The people that had been lawyers and judges in the Third Reich, they had a terrible reputation. So the whole thing would be a big mess, and this is why Adenauer put it down. But you have to see that in Germany, the networks of former Nazis were strong. And Adenauer, who was not a Nazi, he was a conservative from through all these years. But there's a famous quote where he said, "I cannot choose my people. I have to deal with the people that exist." And what he did was kind of show to these Nazi networks, you will be able to live here, but I'm in control. So Globke, who had been responsible for the Nuremberg laws, which is the racial laws of Nazi Germany at the time. And by the way, he never became a party member of the Nazi Party because the Nazi Party would not accept him. He had been in the Center Party before. So it was a strange, but he was responsible for the legal side of the eradication system, the genocidal system from the juridical side in Germany. So that was Globke and then he was high up. So that was a play of Adenauer. But this is what you have to understand. And the Israelis were able to use that. I think blackmail is a little bit, they just, as I said, it's like you have something cooking on the pot and you can adjust the flames a little bit.
Yes,
That's
exactly
what they did. Yeah, so that's what they did. They used it. And I think, in a way, it's use what you have. That's quite
the
reasonable.
nuclear question before handing over to Martin. What happened to the German nuclear program? They didn't get nukes, obviously.
I think you're very right. The Soviets would go berserk. The idea of a Western nuclear power would be outrageous to the Soviets. And there you see that Strauss, the guy who was always a problem, he was very intelligent. I think he's one of our most intelligent former politicians, but a real loose cannon in terms of what he was willing to do. And he had a short temper. That is also, so it was luck that he had to leave with the Spiegel affair. And that's also connected to that. There's other stuff. One thing I want to mention, because I think it's very interesting, is that Adenauer was betrayed by Gehlen. Gehlen had been also a Nazi general, and he was responsible for the Russian forces aiding Germany or collaborating with Germany. So what was called Fremde Heere Ost, foreign armies east. And Gehlen switched sides at the end of the war. He would have been the candidate for the gallows, definitely, because he was responsible for the partisan war to a large scale. But he went to the Americans, and these are my words now, you can hang me or you can use me. I know all about your next upcoming enemy, the Soviets. You don't know anything about it, but I have here in 20 steel drums, I have everything that you want to know about the Soviets, and I can build up my organization, and you will be on the spot in the know about the Soviets. So the Americans took him. There was a part of the CIA which was called the Gehlen Org, and that was renamed to Bundesnachrichtendienst, the West German Intelligence Service. But it was not really. So it is important to understand that Gehlen, when he became head of the BND, he wrote a memo to Critchfield, who was his liaison at the CIA, and said, look, if there's ever the chance that a government in Germany could happen, which is neutral, which is for reunification, and would go together with East Germany to have one Germany again, which was a left-wing issue at that time, not a conservative, completely switched sides during the Cold War. I will have a coup in Germany. I will make sure with my Gladio troops that there will be no good German government. And that was he was a good ally of the American intelligence service. And he worked against Adenauer. What he did, de Gaulle, as I said, was also trying to get nuclear weapons. And the question was, would he allow the Germans to be part of that? And his position was, we will have nuclear weapons, but you have a say on when and how to use them if you join in. And he offered that to Germany. And then what Gehlen did, at that time, de Gaulle, the Organisation Armée Secrète, OAS, they tried to kill de Gaulle several times. They had terror attacks on him with gunmen trying to shoot him. And two of the generals in charge of these operations, they were from Algeria, so from Algeric, the Blackfeet, as they were called, because de Gaulle wanted to give Algiers back in independence, and they were considering that treason. And they were sentenced to death in France. And these two generals were hidden by Gehlen in a paratrooper barrack in Germany. And he made sure that de Gaulle would get to know about that he was hidden. Adenauer didn't know it. So this is how Gehlen torpedoed the talks between Adenauer and Gehlen. And Adenauer summoned Gehlen to him and said, are people from the intelligence service always liars and betrayers and so on. So that was, it was quite interesting because you see the power play in Germany at that time is quite complicated.
So just to summarize your train of thought, and I'll leave it over to Martin, the Gehlen, who was working with the Americans, didn't want and the Americans didn't want Germans to have nukes, and didn't want them to have French nukes, and so they sabotaged the relationship between Adenauer and de Gaulle by protecting a French rebellious parachute general.
Yes, and Adenauer, it's also complicated because Adenauer definitely wanted Germany not neutral. He wanted it to be aligned with the Americans, but he would not completely trust the Americans to be a good ally in case of an invasion from the Soviet Union. But his policy was what is called Westbindung, attached to the West. No?
Right. So, okay, Martin, what are your thoughts about this? Because you've lived and worked a lot in Eastern Europe, and you must have some thoughts.
A very great number. First of all, I fully agree with Dirk's assessment and his factual evidence, but there's much more and other contexts too. First, if one goes back to 1951, the later attempt to kill Chancellor Adenauer. Again, Adenauer was a close ally of Ben-Gurion. The murder assassination attempt came from Menachem Begin and his Irgun people. The man who would directly have been planning the bomb and sending it, we can even identify who he was. He was the same man who blew up the King David Hotel in 1947, and he was the same man who planned the assassination by bombs of David Ben-Gurion himself and the entire democratically elected leadership of the Jewish community in Palestine in 1949. And he was Begin's director of operations and the real operational head of the Irgun Tzvai Amichai Paglin, Paglin. As I've noted in the previous podcast, Paglin was killed in a car crash in 1977, right after Begin had taken power. And Begin, being the witless fool he was, had already announced he was putting Paglin in the head of the Israeli deep state, the head of the Mossad, head of Shin Bet, head of all deep state activities. And Paglin was known in the deep state, first of all, as an out-of-control anti-democratic assassin, and also as a maniac. So nobody has ever commented on this publicly, though I can tell you I was working in the Jerusalem Post very young at the time, and I wasn't an Israeli. I was this. They gave me the job because I had an Oxford degree, and I didn't even have a formal work visa. I was just there on sufferance, so I was the lowest of the low. But I kept my ears open. And serious people who were covering defense issues talked about it. And there was serious speculation, both in the army and in the journalism community in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, that Paglin's death was not accidental. But nobody wanted to go too far because everybody realized he was a murderer and a maniac, and Begin believed him implicitly. So there was that. But if you go back to the riots in 1951 that Dirk referred to, it was even more than that. Begin and Ben-Gurion hated each other. And Begin was anti-democratic, and Ben-Gurion recognized this. The riots in 1951 were very clear-cut. What was public and outraged the Israeli public at the time was the whole idea of being paid reparations by Germany. But this was a crucial factor, because Dirk is absolutely right, and I would go even further than you do, Dirk, because not only was German financial aid crucial to building up the military power of Israel and paying for the Dimona reactor, it had earlier been crucial to the very economic survival of the state in 1950-51, because the Israeli state had taken in 600,000 refugees. There was this massive, from the Arab world alone, there was this massive shift of population. All the 750,000 Palestinians, Arabs, fled Israel or were pushed out of Israel. And incidentally, the key figure in doing that, who did the dirty work of basically just terrorizing them and making sure they went, was a senior Palmach, elite force commander at the time. We have heard a lot more about since, Yitzhak Rabin.
I didn't know. Okay.
He was central. I mean, he is deified since his death. And he was sincere for peace, and he had, I believe, he and many others do. He was actually assassinated in 1995 by the deep state with Shimon Peres's full knowledge, because he had it is a matter of fact, and it is established that Rabin had established a peace treaty with Syria and was going to give the Golan Heights back to Syria in 1995 in return for a lasting peace. He and Assad trusted each other. Neither of them trusted Yasser Arafat. You know, the division that all Palestinians are good, or all Arabs, including Palestinians, are bad, and all Israelis are either warmongers or peacemongers. I know you know better, Dirk, but as we both know, it's not like that, as you've pointed out on the Ben-Gurion, the Begin divide. And in Germany, these things are divided down the middle. You have people on one side, people on the other. Now, the hatred between Rabin and Peres lasted for 40 years. Rabin is open about this hatred in the first edition of his own memoirs, published in the mid-1990s, late 1970s, after he had been ousted as leader of the Labour Party by Peres, and he thought he had no political future. But of course, he came back as both defense minister and as prime minister. Certainly. Dirk again has hit pay dirt. His description of the internal conflicts in Israel is spot on, exactly right. And they go even deeper, because in 1951, the upheaval against the protests against the relationship with Germany and between Ben-Gurion and Adenauer went even deeper. It went incredibly deep. And there are much more profound issues involved. At stake was the very survival of the state of Israel, not because of the threat of the Arabs, not because of any threat from the Federal Republic of Germany, but because of civil war and the destruction of democracy that Menachem Begin was deliberately stirring up. When the issue of reparations, of German financial payments to Holocaust survivors in Israel came up, and it was passed, and of course it was tied to the issue of further secret German aid to Israel as well, Begin erupted and tried to storm the Knesset, and the Knesset could easily have been burned down. The mob was that violent in 1951. Ben-Gurion acknowledged this. He ordered out the police. They used tear gas, and Ben-Gurion was prepared to use lethal force if necessary against Begin's supporters when they were storming the Knesset. And of course, the whole issue was so dramatic that it did not demoralize Begin. It compromised him in the eyes of the whole Israeli public at that time. Begin came across, and in my observation of him 25 years later, very rightly so, as a hysteric, as a maniac, as a demagogue. and as somebody totally irresponsible who was prepared to destroy the infant Israeli state with civil war and revolution if necessary, just to get his way. He was that hysterical. He was that out of control. The language he used in 1951 to stir up the crowds to attempt to storm the Israeli parliament was quite extraordinary. But Ben-Gurion was right for another, even more fundamental reason. Had Adenauer not given that aid to Israel, the state of Israel would have collapsed anyway by the end of 1952 in famine and hardship. Because Israel was a socialist, run on socialist principles from its origins in 1948. The socialism wasn't working. They had brought in 600,000 Jewish refugees. We all hear, and rightly so, about the 750,000 Palestinian refugees from the Arab world. But between 600,000 to 800,000 or 900,000, the figures are not clear, the number who left. But certainly at least 700,000 did come to Israel in the first 3 years of the state after they were expelled from Arab countries in retaliation for the establishment of the Jewish state in the heart of Islamic lands. And there was no aid whatsoever from the United States government, none, to aid this. There were record sums in many millions of dollars raised by the United Jewish Appeal from the Jewish community privately in the United States of America. That did in fact happen. And in fact, in 1956 and 57, to make sure Ben-Gurion withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula and from threatening Egypt, Dwight D. Eisenhower, very different from presidents since 1967, Eisenhower directly threatened the Israelis and Ben-Gurion himself that he would cut off all financial aid from the American Jewish community to build the economy of Israel and the state of Israel, unless Israel bowed down to the American diktat, which Ben-Gurion did. He pulled out of the Sinai in 1957. In those days, it was the opposite of today. Israel was a tiny little postage stamp of a nation, and the United States was an even more dominant global power than it is today, and it did not even give any military aid to Israel. And it certainly gave no civilian aid to Israel. On the contrary, President Harry S. Truman and Secretary of State Dean Acheson were both virulent personal anti-Semites. They were both also great Anglophiles, incidentally. Acheson had three great racist enemies who he despised and loathed: the Jews, the Irish, and the Indians. And he was the Democratic Party Secretary of State for 4 years. Not a penny of U.S. government aid flowed to Israel during those 4 years. Things improved slowly but very steadily under Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was certainly not in Israel's pocket. He forced Ben-Gurion out of Sinai in 1956-57, but he was a fair-minded man. And he was a well-meaning man who meant well towards both the Palestinians and towards the Israelis, given the dynamics that were already set up by the Truman administration. And in the 1948 war and afterwards, there wasn't that much Eisenhower could do to repair the underlying problems with either side. But he was head and shoulders, in terms, ironically, of his relationship with the Israelis, he was head and shoulders above Truman and Acheson. These are very important issues, and it doesn't contradict a word of what Dirk says. Every word Dirk said, I fully agree with, and he's absolutely on the ball with. And there is another extraordinary irony in this, and that is the Israelis, of course, knew about the Nazis that Adenauer had in his administration, and that, as Dirk rightly said, even Adenauer himself could not escape from. And the Israelis dealt with them too. One of the most notorious Nazis who had helped establish anti-Semitism institutionally in Syria and Egypt in the 1950s, in the 1960s, was bought and bribed and protected by the Israelis. And that was the legendary SS commando leader Otto Skorzeny. There's a very famous movie, and the scene in the movie, and I know Dirk will be familiar with it, The Odessa File, written by Frederick Forsyth, who had very strong British intelligence connections all his life. and it purported to be the story of the underground war that was fought very ferociously in the 1950s and 60s between the Israeli Secret Service and the Odessa, which was the organization of retired SS men. And this was real. And where this also kicks in is another point Dirk brought up, and again, I fully agree with and confirm and would expand upon, and that is the role of German military aid. The main military force that Israel used to smash the Egyptian army in Sinai and win the Six-Day War was with American-built Patton M60 tanks. But although they had been built by the United States, they had, in fact, been supplied by the United States not to Israel, which, remember, Truman had refused to do so. And because of the opposition of the Truman wing of the Democratic Party, President Eisenhower was in no position to supply them either, and did not want to. But the solution that was reached between the US, Adenauer, and Israel was that Germany would provide the American Patton tanks the United States had given to Germany after Germany joined NATO, and it would give them to Israel. But this was opposed in Germany, as Dirk pointed out, by the old ex-Nazis who were still deeply embedded. And they thought in 1963, when Der Alte, the great Adenauer, retired, Adenauer had been determined that Israel should get its tanks. So was President John Kennedy. All these anti-Semitic claims that the Israelis and the Jews were behind the assassination of President Kennedy is more just anti-Semitic shit. Kennedy was opposed to the Israelis building the Dimona nuclear reactor, but like Eisenhower before him, he was really rather weak-kneed about it and was ready to keep just negotiating to put off any major confrontation, because he visited the death camps at the end of the war. He felt conflicted on Israel-related issues. But the hopes of the Nazis in Germany and elsewhere that the deal with the Patton tanks would not go through was dashed on them by two people. Ludwig Erhard, Adenauer's successor, was a softie, and he was ready to drop the deal and yield to Nazi pressure, is my understanding. I stand to be corrected by you on that, Dirk. But John Kennedy insisted the deal go through. When President Kennedy was assassinated, the Odessa people in Germany had hopes that then the pressure on Ludwig Erhard would end from the American government now that President Kennedy had been murdered, and that they would be able to block the deal. But no, because it turned out, of course, that Lyndon Johnson was even a stronger supporter of arms to Israel than President John Kennedy before him had been. And of course, when Richard Nixon came in, he was a stronger supporter of building Israel up to the hilt than either of his predecessors. But of course, it was a different leadership in Israel. It was a labor secular leadership, which was tough and expansionist and ruthless, very ruthless. But they were not eschatological maniacs. I think we should do a separate show. And Dirk, if you'd be interested in coming on, you might need to contribute to it too. And that's what you raised, Pelle, the dispensationalist business. We have a U.S., one last point. Today, we have a U.S. ambassador to Israel, the link man between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and that's Ambassador Mike Huckabee, very strongly pro-Israel, former governor of Arkansas, personally an admirable and very nice man, but he's certainly an end of times eschatologist, passion fellow in the terms that you described, Pelle. Whether he's a dispensationalist or not literally, I'm not quite sure. And we also need to do a separate show on the dispensationalist power in America, which you are right. At least 100 million Americans literally believe. They actually believe Israel must be destroyed in the war of Gog and Magog, but they don't realize that if there was such a war, it would be a World War III and America would be destroyed too. They think America will not be destroyed, and they certainly think they'll be whisked up to heaven before the Messiah, whoever he is, comes.
Sorry. Well, you just hand over to Dirk a little bit. I just want to say that it's extraordinary. I mean, like, let's say Tucker Carlson and people like that. I'm sure you can go to places and find critiques of this dispensationalism in American life, but where are all the secular critics, the American conservatives,
I can tell you very quickly.
I look at responsible statecraft, and foreign policy. We can't expect too much from them, but nobody raises this question. And if that's 100
No,
million,
they
that's an
don't.
enormous lobby.
They
That's like,
don't take it seriously.
oh, I see.
They don't
Okay,
take it seriously.
right, I see.
They believe it's hogwash, and it is
Of
hogwash.
course it is.
But
It's a pure conspiracy theory. It's fairy tale.
yes,
They
but
cherry
it's
pick the
dangerous
Bible,
hogwash.
and they say
Exactly, Pele.
it's a
They think it's harmless hogwash. It's phenomenally dangerous hogwash.
and then they take stuff from novels. I mean, you've heard about they'll say a bit of slice of Revelations and the slice of
Oh yeah,
Thessalonians, and then a
Joe
random quote
Rosenberg, who
from
was a Jewish convert to
Paul's
this
letter,
kind
and
of
then they'll
stuff.
Pulp
mix it
Fiction.
up, and then if it doesn't come true, they say, well, and then they'll find another piece. It's quite extraordinary. I mean, it's conspiracy theories times 10. But Dirk,
Dirk, you see
I just say
why we have to have you back.
we'll
I
leave
mean,
it to
there's
Dirk
so much more to explore.
yeah.
And
Dick, I just say
expose.
the Skorzeny thing. I mean, this Odessa thing comes a little bit to my research interest and Dog Hammarskjöld, because Skorzeny was assembled mercenaries and farmed them out to Africa, and he was a Mossad asset. And there's speculation that Skorzeny or one of his assets whisked Lumumba away from his protection in Congo, and the Lumumba story still reverberates. I mean, the Russians have decided to rename their foreign university for Africans.
Oh yeah,
Patrice Lumumba
I mean,
University.
that was ultimately. It wouldn't surprise me. That was a CIA. That was a CIA hit job, and Alan Dulles fully approved.
Yeah, it was, but we still have the CIA paper saying that somebody fitting the description of. Anyway, we'll talk about that because people are getting confused by all these references. And I just want to say another thing about the tragedy from my perspective of the German-Jewish conflict, if you like, because the British, I mean, my view of the British around the turn of the last century was that they were a nation of lazy fox hunting and deeply intellectual aristocrats, and they disliked Germany as much because of Germany's intellectual culture as anything else. I mean, Britain had Oxford and Cambridge, and Germany had many universities. They were winning all the Nobel Prizes. They had philosophers which Britain just couldn't compete with, and so it was envy. But the point is, in all the papers I read about World War One before that, I saw no different. They didn't distinguish between the Germans and the Jews. They thought a German was a Jew, and a Jew was a German, because they were both intellectual and successful. And so there's actually a similarity between. So when King Edward said, "Oh, he's a German," that meant he's a Jew, basically, because they occupied the same space for the British aristocrat, the British fox hunting, intellectually lazy, who thought these Germans were upstarts who competed with them on their brains, just as Jews do traditionally when in our society. Martin, sorry, we've got to finish there. Dirk, do you want to say some final words before we finish?
Well, just actually, first of all, we must have Dirk you back as soon as possible, Dirk. We've already started. But secondly, on your last point, Pelle, I found myself being passionately shouting here, not because of disagreement, but because of so much passionate agreement with you both. The crucial state paper that convinced the Lloyd George War Cabinet in 1917 to issue the Balfour Declaration reflected exactly the prejudices that you just said. What it said was the Germany and the Zionists are each other's closest allies. The Zionists are keeping America out of the war and are pushing Russia out of the war through revolution in order to support Germany. There was no truth to any of that stuff. It was all absolute nonsense. But it was written by Sir Mark Sykes, who was the leading expert, supposedly, God help us, for the British government on Middle East issues and on Jewish affairs. And it was his state paper, which has to be read and quoted to understand how embarrassing it was. It was like an extract from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, purple-passioned lunacy. But the British government believed it, and that's why they issued the Balfour Declaration. The Zionist movement at the time under Chaim Weizmann were a bunch of dreamy twits. They were assholes. They were jerks. They were not brilliantly cunning. They did not have limitless sums of money. The main Jewish financiers and billionaires in both Britain and America would not touch them with a barge pole. But because Mark Sykes took his anti-Semitism seriously, he convinced the British government that the Jews were a world power when they were powerless. So it's another of these black ironies and holes of history. It just opened up another endless can of worms and confusion.
Right. So he gave them that land because he wanted to propitiate
He
them.
He didn't even give them the land. He promised the
I promised
establishment
them
of a
the land.
national home in Palestine, not even a state. He was going to make it a state, but the two British members of the British War Cabinet opposed Zionism and opposed referring to building a state for the Jews. So
Right.
it was watered
But
down in the declaration to a
what
homeland.
has that got
But
to
the
do with
reason it
Germany?
was given was to get the Jews on Britain's side in the United States, in
See.
Washington, and also to keep Russia in the war and convince the communists to keep the Soviet Union in the
Right,
war,
got you.
because these
All right.
people imagined the Zionists controlled the communists, and they didn't.
All right. But and has that got anything to do with Germany?
Yes, it fits with what you were saying.
Right.
They bought this because they bought the anti-Semitic and anti-German bigotry of the previous 20 years, that everything German was Jewish and everything
Right.
Jewish was German,
Right.
and any good
Yeah.
Englishman should despise both Jews and Germans.
Right.
They
And the
believed all
Germans
of
were
that.
elected to control Russia as well, weren't they? But
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
I'll leave the
That's what
final word to
Churchill
you.
claimed.
Sorry. What do you think?
No,
Have
you're
you got
right.
any
That's what
remarks on
Churchill
this?
claimed.
I think it's extremely interesting and it's extremely informative, your talk. So I'm happy with just listening to it. What I can say
I feel
is,
that way
as
about
I
you.
mentioned,
Okay, we'll cut out
the
this
thing
love
is
stuff,
that the
honestly. All right.
irony is, as we all now we're talking about, is that the Germany Jews, which is hard to understand for people who are familiar with the law that we have today, were very close,
Exactly.
and they were close because there was a strong similarity in terms of, you could also say for the Jews, it was a possibility to become something else in Germany. And for Germany, it was a state on the rise through industrialization and it was stood against the old empire of Great Britain. And there's a strong, I can see that, and that is not known today. It is from the
Exactly.
perspective, it's kind of a tragedy because it would have fit very well together. And the point is also
Exactly.
what I think, what we can see is that the amount of intellectual capability of understanding what was going on was not very good in the superpowers of that time. It was
Exactly like
they
today, Dirk.
yeah, this is what I mean. It is like today
Exactly.
that
Yeah.
they don't understand
Exactly.
what's going on. And conversations like we just have it might be a good clue.
Right.
You have to you have to listen to alternative media, meanwhile, to get more or less
Yes.
accurate, a more or
Well,
less accurate view of what's
yeah.
happening. I don't say that I have an accurate view, but
No.
this is much more quality than we get in 10
I know. I
years
mean,
of
I was
mainstream.
complaining.
Yeah.
I'll say the last words now, okay? And
Yes.
that is a
Okay.
self-congratulatory remark, which is that I was saying to a friend, an English friend, I'm saying there's the problem with the UK right now, and that's probably true of the countries whose language I don't speak, is that there's no intelligentsia and there's nothing that really stimulates me. That's there's some Americans who do, I mean, America is a bigger country and more free, I guess. But the Britain, there's nothing interesting come out. It's not the Britain I remember from the 70s and 80s, where you had interesting discussions
Yeah.
on Radio 3 and Radio 4 and on BBC 2 late night, often by Jews, actually. But now it's all smoothed out and very boring. Anyway, gentlemen, so you listen to this show, and Dirk, just I'll put your documentary down in the comments box or in the introduction, the information box. But where can they find this video on your German and Israel? Is it available on YouTube?
It's on YouTube. I just noticed it had been in an illegal version on YouTube and it got something like 1.2 million clicks and then it was taken out.
Wow.
The comments were weird, really weird. Yeah.
Yeah.
But now it's back.
We all
It's
get that,
back
Dirk.
back on YouTube, and give you the link. And it's worthwhile watching because, with the exception of Seymour Hersh, I have all the major people who have something to talk about in there. There's Peter Hanem in it, who broke the Mordechai Vanunu story. There's Avner Cohen, who is the academic on the issue of nuclear weapons. And I would have loved to have Seymour Hersh. I even talked to them at that time on the phone, and I begged him to interview. And he said, "I don't do interviews on stuff that I've done." That is a long time ago. Yeah, it was.
Very briefly, I worked personally with Cy Hirsch 22 years ago when we were both working on exposés of the plots to start the Second Iraq War. And it was a joy working with him. But even I said to him at the end of our collaboration, can I keep sending you stuff, Cy? And Cy replied, no, don't send me anything, because anything you send me, I'll steal from you. In other words, he's a
That's
totally honest man.
I think all journalists do
but
that.
also
They
he's
just
a
don't
loner.
admit it. Yeah. Anyway, we've got to end
Yes,
there.
exactly.
I expect this conversation to turn up once our viewers have absorbed it and put it up in a big circulation
I hope
magazine.
so.
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Again, I love it. It's great. Great to be with you.